The postal road through Dunmore ran north until it didn't, which was the point. A place where the railway had been promised twice and built once and then only halfway, so that the branch line ended at a grain elevator and a platform with no shelter on the east side, which meant that in November the wind came directly at you before you'd gotten your bearings. She stepped off on a Wednesday. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the cold had the particular quality of cold that had been cold for weeks and intended to stay that way. She had one trunk and one bag. The trunk she left on the platform, the bag she carried. The town was small enough that you could see most of it from where she stood. A feed merchant, a hardware, a hotel with a sign that had lost 2 letters and hadn't been corrected. A church white-painted with a bell that looked too large for the tower it sat in, as if someone had planned ahead for a congregation that hadn't arrived yet. She stood in the wind for a moment and looked at it all, and then she picked up the trunk and walked toward the hotel. The woman at the front desk had the look of someone who had been expecting her for longer than she had been expected. She was looking, she said, for a man whose name she read from a letter in her coat pocket. The letter was from 6 weeks ago. She had read it enough times that the paper had gone soft at the folds. The woman looked at her once, looked at the trunk, looked back. "He'll be up at the claim," she said. "Takes the road north past the feed merchant, about 4 miles out. You'd know it by the stand of spruce that bends east at the top of the rise." She paused. "He comes in Thursdays for supplies. Tomorrow." She said she would wait. She took the room that was offered, set her trunk along the wall, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment without taking off her coat. The window faced the street. Below it, a man was loading something into a sleigh. A boy of about 10 was helping in the way children help, which is to say he was mostly in the way and committed to it. She took off her coat. The letter was in the pocket. She did not take it out again. She knew what it said. She had answered the notice in a church paper, which was not the sort of thing she had imagined herself doing. But she had been living in her sister's house for 7 months by then, in the small room off the kitchen that smelled of boiled linen no matter how often the window was opened. And her sister meant well, and her brother-in-law meant well. And the children were fine children, but the house was not hers. Nothing in it was hers. She had learned that winter what it felt like to move through rooms that would never be your rooms, to eat at a table that would never be your table, to sleep in a bed that existed only because someone had made space for you. The notice had been plain. A man working a mixed farm and a timber claim north of Dunmore, looking for someone capable of keeping a house and willing to settle in a place with hard winters and slow springs. He had been honest about the winters. She had appreciated that. She had written back the same day she read it. 2 weeks later, his reply came. Longer than she expected. The handwriting careful, as if he were used to measuring things twice before committing to them. He said he had 2 rooms to offer. He said the work was real work and he would not pretend otherwise. He said, near the end of the letter, that he had been alone for 3 years and was not certain he was easy company anymore, but that he was not difficult on purpose. That was the sentence she had returned to most. She had packed the trunk in 2 days and told her sister the following Sunday. Her sister had cried. Her brother-in-law had driven her to the station and shaken her hand at the platform without quite meeting her eyes, which she understood to mean he was relieved and was sorry about being relieved. And she held no particular feeling about either. The train north had taken most of a day. The land flattened and then opened and then flattened again into something that wasn't quite prairie and wasn't quite bush, just a long cold stretching out toward a sky that seemed to have more room in it than skies further south. She had watched it through the window and not tried to think too much about what she was doing. She ate supper in the hotel dining room that evening. A woman named Tilda, who worked the kitchen, brought her soup without being asked and stood in the doorway a moment before going back. The soup was good. She ate all of it. She slept better than she expected. In the morning she was up before the dining room opened and stood in the cold of her room at the window. The street was quiet. A horse tied outside the hardware. The boy from yesterday, this time without his sleigh, running somewhere with the singular determination of a child who has somewhere to be that no adult has told him to be. The sky to the east had a thin line of copper in it that widened while she watched. She thought about the letter. She thought about what it meant to go towards something rather than away from something. She had spent enough time knowing the difference to know she did not always choose correctly. The front door of the hotel opened at some point mid-morning, and she heard boots on the stairs and then a knock at her door that was neither tentative nor demanding. Just a knock. She opened it. He was taller than the letter had suggested, though letters suggest nothing about height. He had come in from the cold and not taken his coat off yet, which meant he had come straight up without stopping. His hat was in his hand, he had dark hair going gray at the edges, and the kind of face that had spent most of its time outdoors and showed it. Not aged badly, just weathered in the way that is different from aged. He looked at her the way a person looks when they've been carrying a picture in their head and are comparing it to the thing itself. She let him, then he said, "You made it." "I did," she said. "Good journey? Long one." He nodded as if this were the expected answer, which it was. "I've got the sleigh," he said. When you're ready, she was ready. She put on her coat, and he carried the trunk down the stairs and loaded it himself without making a production of it. She carried the bag. He did not comment on the bag. He had looked at it and seen she had it, and that was enough. Outside, the cold had a different quality in the open air than it had through a window. Sharper, more honest. The sleigh was a working sleigh, not a pleasure one, with room behind the seat for the trunk and a wool blanket folded on the bench. He checked the trunk once it was loaded, checked the tie-down, and then moved to the horse, a broad-chested roan that stood without complaint. She climbed up on the right side. He climbed up on the left. He gathered the reins and the horse moved without being asked to hurry. The town passed, and then the road opened north and the spruce closed in on either side. She sat with the blanket across her lap. The cold was the kind that settled in if you let it, so she didn't let it. He said, after a while, "The road's better in winter usually. Pack down." She said, "Is it bad in spring?" 6 weeks, he said. "Give or take. I come in by horseback when the sleigh can't make it." She considered this. "And supplies?" "I plan ahead," he said. That was all. She looked at the spruce going past on either side. Their tops were bent east, as the woman at the hotel had said they would be. Wind from the northwest then, and steady over time to have shaped the trees that way. She noted it without comment. The claim came into view before he pointed it out. A log house with a sod roof that had been there long enough to look like it had grown from the ground rather than been built on it. Behind it a barn, newer, with board siding that still showed its fresh cut. A root cellar door set into the rise at the east side. A woodpile that was serious, not decorative. Stand of poplar to the north that would break some of the wind. He stopped the sleigh in the yard. She climbed down before he had the reins fully wrapped. She stood in the yard and looked at the house. The light was flat and even, and showed everything without favor. He brought the trunk. She held the door. Inside. A main room with a stove already going, which meant he had been out to start it before coming into town for her. A table, 2 chairs, a lamp, a window with a view of the yard that was practical more than scenic. The floor was wood, old boards but swept, kind of swept that had stopped being an act and become a condition. Off the main room, a door. He set the trunk down. "That room is yours," he said. "I sleep in the loft above the barn in summer. In winter, I'm here." He nodded toward a second door she had not noticed. "Corner room. There's a stove in it." She opened the door he had indicated for her. A bed with 2 quilts, both plain, both clean. A hook on the wall. A small window that faced east and would have light in the mornings. She turned back to the main room. "I'll start supper," she said. He looked at her once, not long, and then he went back out to see to the horse. She found what she needed. The stove was good iron and drew well, which told her something about how the house had been maintained. Potatoes in the root cellar off the back hall, salt pork hanging in the cold room beside it. Panions in a net bag from a ceiling beam. She had learned what a kitchen could tell you about the person who kept it, and this kitchen told her that someone had been managing, steadily and without pleasure, for longer than was quite right. He came back in when supper was near done and washed at the basin by the back door without being asked. She set the food down and they ate without much talk. The wind moved outside. The stove worked against it. The lamp gave the room a color she did not yet have a name for in this house. At some point he said, "There's wood enough through February. I'll cut more in March when the sap's still down." She said, "What's the stand?" He said, "Mostly poplar, some tamarack up the slope." She nodded. She had not grown up in timber country, but she had spent 2 years in the bush camps with her first husband, and she knew the difference between woods that would heat you and woods that would only make you think they were. He looked at her once when she said nothing further, as though he had expected a question and had prepared himself for it, and now had to put the preparation away unused. She did not explain. It was not yet her habit to explain herself to people she had just met, and she was not certain it would become that habit here. He did not ask. She took that in the way you take something small but not insignificant, filed it somewhere. In the morning she was up in the gray before the light had decided what it would be. She made the fire and set the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window while it heated. The yard was still. The roan was visible through the barn door, which he had left open a foot, steam rising from the animal in the cold. He came in from outside while she was still at the window, boots already on, which meant he had been up before her, which she had not heard. He had been quiet about it. He stopped when he saw the coffee. He said, "I was going to do that," she said. "I know." She poured him a cup and set it on the table and moved to get her own from the shelf. He watched her for a moment longer than was necessary and then sat down and wrapped his hands around the cup. The light came up. The yard turned from gray to a cold white blue. A pair of whiskey jacks landed on the woodpile and argued over something and left. He finished his coffee and stood. "I'll be at the fence line until midday. There's a section down from the snow weight," she said. "I'll have dinner ready." He took his hat from the peg. He paused at the door. "The corner room off the kitchen," he said. "The light's good in there until about 2 in the afternoon, if you have work." He meant the mending. She had unpacked her sewing kit the evening before and left it on the table in plain sight because she had not yet found the right shelf. He had seen it. She didn't answer immediately. Not because she had nothing to say, because the noticing of it required a small private accounting, and she did not want to rush the accounting. "I'll look at it," she said. He went out. She stood at the window and watched him cross the yard, the collar of his coat up against the wind, moving with the steady, unhurried purpose of a man who knows exactly what is in front of him for the next several hours. The fence line, the broken section, work that needed doing, that he would do. She turned back to the kitchen. There was a woman in the first town south of Dunmore who had written her a letter the week she left. Not a warm letter, a worried one. She had folded it and kept it and not answered it. And eventually it had gotten mixed in with the packing, and she had found it in the trunk the night before. She had read it again standing in the cold room light. "You don't know this man," the letter said. "You are going a long way on the word of a stranger." She had thought about that on the train. She had thought about it again, reading the letter in the cold light of a room she had not yet learned, and she had put it back in the trunk and closed the lid. The letter was not wrong, but it was not complete. She knew certain things already. She knew the woodpile and what it said about preparedness. She knew the sweep of the floor and what it said about the long discipline of living alone. She knew he had started the fire before coming to town. She knew he had said, "I'm not certain I'm easy company anymore," and had not said it to excuse himself, but to tell the truth in a space where the truth was useful. You could know a man from a letter. You could know him from the way he loaded a trunk. You could know him from the way he said, "If you have work," which was not a question and not an order, but something that left the room entirely open. She knew enough to keep going. She had always been good at knowing the difference between a thing that was uncertain and a thing that was wrong. A boy named Quentin began coming by on the days when there was post to deliver or supplies to drop from the general store. He was perhaps 12, serious-faced, with a horse that was too big for him, and a manner that suggested he was aware of this and not concerned by it. He would stop at the yard, call once, and if she came out, he would hand down whatever he had. If she didn't come out, he left it by the porch. The first time she came to the door, he looked at her for a moment with the candid appraisal of someone who has been briefed by a town. Then he said, "You're the one from the train," she said. "I am." He nodded, handed down a paper-wrapped parcel and said, "Mrs. Tilda says to tell you she put in extra soda." He turned the horse before she could answer. She stood on the step with the parcel and looked after him. The days found their shape without being planned. She cooked, she mended, she learned the house the way you learn any place that isn't yours. by moving through it slowly, testing its habits, noting what held and what needed attention. The front door swung inward and latched clean. The back door swung inward and latched only if you lifted it slightly as you closed it, a thing you learned once and then did without thinking. The stove needed feeding at 4-hour intervals through the coldest nights. The water in the hand pump took a long pull on cold mornings to start. These were not complaints. They were the grammar of the place, and she was learning to read it. He came in each evening at the same time, and washed his hands and ate what she put in front of him, and did not comment on the food, except occasionally to say something that wasn't quite a compliment, but was pointed in that direction. Once he said, "The potatoes were better last night." She said, "They were the same potatoes." He looked at her then, and something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face and was gone. She filed it away. One morning in her second week, she noticed the axe had been resharpened. It had been hanging by the back door, and she had used it once to split kindling. She had thought at the time that the edge was going, but had not said so. The following morning it was sharp. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. The knowing was its own kind of conversation. She was learning there were two kinds of silence in the house. The kind that came from not having anything to say, which was comfortable the way a room is comfortable when it's the right temperature. And the kind that came from having something to say and not yet knowing the right way to say it. She was beginning to understand which kind she was sitting inside at any given moment. That understanding took time. She was giving it time. One afternoon toward the end of the second week, Quentin arrived with a letter. Not a supply letter, a real letter addressed to her in her sister's handwriting. She took it inside and set it on the table and did not open it immediately. He came in at evening and saw it there. He said nothing. She set supper out. They ate. The letter stayed on the table. She washed the plates, and by the time she had finished, he had moved to the corner chair with his accounts book and the lamp between them, and the letter was still on the table. Later, after he had gone to his room, she opened it. Her sister wrote the way she always did, with love that was real and anxiety that was also real, and the particular combination of the two that meant she was always trying to talk people out of things she suspected might be good for them. The letter asked, was she warm enough? Was she safe? Was she eating? Was the man what he had seemed to be? She folded it and set it aside. She sat at the table for a little while, with her hands around an empty cup. Outside, the wind was up. She could hear it finding the gap above the north window, a low note that wasn't quite a sound, just a presence. Was he what he had seemed to be? She thought about the act. She thought about the fire started before he came to get her. She thought about if you have work, and the way he moved past her in the kitchen without crowding her space, and the fact that he did not fill silence with noise. She thought about the corner room which she had begun using, which she had not yet mentioned to him, and which he had not raised again. The lamp burned low. She trimmed it and went to bed. The following week, a stretch of cold came down from the north that was serious cold, the kind that split wood and silenced birds and made the air feel like something that had opinions. She kept the fire through the night in 2-hour shifts, which she had not told him she intended to do. On the third morning, he came in from checking the barn earlier than usual, and she was already up and the kitchen was warm. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the stove. He looked at her. She said, "Go warm up." He came in and sat. She set coffee in front of him. He had been outside in that cold, and his hands were cold even through the gloves. She had noticed that, and moved the coffee closer to the edge of the table where he could reach it without stretching. He said, "You were up in the night." It was not a question. She said, "The cold needed watching." He said, "You should have woken me." She said, "You were up until midnight with the accounts." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You noticed that." She didn't answer. He drank his coffee and looked out the window at the yard, which was white and still and bright in the early light, and she thought he was going to let it go. Then he said, without turning, "Thank you." She said, "The fire needed keeping." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away for a long moment. Then she picked up her cup, and he looked at his accounts book. And the kitchen went back to its regular order. And yet something in its proportions had shifted, the way the proportions of a room shift when you move a piece of furniture and then stand back and understand that it was always missing from that corner. By the fourth week, she knew his schedule better than her own. She knew when he would come in with wood, and when he would come in for water, and when he was at the barn and when he was at the fence. She knew the sound of his boots on the step, and the sound of the back door doing its particular thing. She knew the way he moved through the main room when he thought she was asleep, carefully taking up as little of the space as possible. She did not know what to do with the knowing. So she continued doing what she had been doing, which was paying attention and keeping her own counsel and letting the days accumulate. Quentin brought word one Thursday that there was a meeting at the church hall, a neighborhood supper. He looked at her when he said it in the way children look when they are delivering a message they've been told to deliver and are not sure how it will be received. He mentioned it at supper that evening, casually, in the way he mentioned most things, as if offering a fact and leaving her to determine its weight. She said, "Do you usually go?" He said, "Not always." She considered her soup, but sometimes. He said, "Yes." She picked up her bread. "Then we should go." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "All right." The church hall was warm and crowded and smelled of wood smoke and something sweet that turned out to be a pie on the table near the back. The women looked at her in the way women look at someone new, some with welcome, some with appraisal, most with a combination of both that had a reasonable half-life. She did not try to be anything other than herself. A woman named Dorothea Casson, who ran the dry goods, introduced herself with the directness of someone who has no patience for slow starts. She said, "You're the one who came up from the east." She said she was. Dorothea Casson looked at her steadily. "Staying?" she said. She met the woman's eyes. "I expect so," she said. He was talking to a man near the door who she would later learn was a neighboring farmer named Aldwin Goss, 2 miles east, with 3 grown sons and a wife who had died the previous spring. He glanced across the room once while she was talking to Dorothea Casson. She did not look back immediately. She waited until there was a natural pause in the conversation. He was still looking when she turned. She held his look for a moment and then turned back to Dorothea Casson and asked about the road south in winter, which was a practical question and also a way of letting the moment pass without running from it. On the way home, the cold was clear and the stars were the kind of stars you only get when there has been no cloud for a week, and the air is too cold for anything but honesty. He drove and she sat with the blanket across her lap, and neither of them spoke for most of the way. Then she said, "Dorothea Casson seems to know everything about everyone." He said, "She does. Is that convenient or inconvenient?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Depends on the day." She felt something move through her that was not quite laughter but was related to it, and she did not try to stop it. He heard it. He glanced at her once. The roan went on through the dark and the cold, steady and unhurried. The winter held. The days were short and the work was long in the way that winter work is long. Not because there was more of it, but because everything required more effort in the cold. She learned that the root cellar needed checking after a hard freeze because the ventilation pipe iced up. She learned that the well had to be covered before sundown or the chain froze to the handle. She learned these things by learning them, which is to say by doing them once wrong and then doing them correctly after that. He did not always tell her things ahead of time. She had come to understand this was not withholding. It was that he had been doing these things alone long enough that he had forgotten they required telling. When she found this out herself, she would mention it once and matter-of-factly, and he would look at her and say something like, "I should have said," and she would say, "Now you have," and that would be the end of it. One afternoon, she was at the corner room table with a coat that needed relining when she heard him in the main room talking to someone. A low voice, a child's voice. She stayed where she was. After a while, the door opened and Quentin stood in the frame with his hat in his hand looking at the floor. "Mrs. Tilda's asking," he said, "if you'd be willing to come in for the church social. They're short-handed." He delivered this with the gravity of a man delivering treaty terms. She set the coat down. "When?" he told her. She considered. "Tell her yes." He turned to go. She said, "Quentin, have you eaten today?" He looked at the window briefly, then at the floor. Then he said, "I had breakfast." She went to the kitchen and cut bread and salt pork and put it in a cloth. She handed it to him and he took it with the practiced care of a child who has been given things carefully enough times to know how to receive them. He said, "Thank you, ma'am." He went out. She stood in the main room for a moment. The door to the outside still had the last of his cold in it. She heard him say something in the yard, and then she heard the answer, which was longer, and she understood that he had been out there the whole time and had sent the boy in for some reason of his own. She went back to the coat. He came in for supper and they ate. Afterward, she said, "You sent him in." He said, "The boy doesn't always eat." She said, "I know." He pushed back from the table. He picked up his plate and brought it to the basin. She watched him do it. "The coat?" he said without turning. She said, "Done." He nodded once. He got his accounts book and settled in the corner. She took out the next thing that needed doing and settled at the table. The lamp was between them, and the stove spoke quietly. And outside the wind had gone still for once, and the cold was the kind that was just cold, without commentary. She looked up once and found him looking at her. He looked back down at his accounts. She looked back down at her work. The lamp burned. She had come to this country with one trunk and a bag and a letter soft at the folds and the ordinary arithmetic of a woman making a practical decision. She had told herself that is what it was. Practical. A house to live in, work to do, a man who was honest about the winters. She sat with her work in the lamplight and thought about that. Thought about how the words we use for the beginning of things are never quite the same as the words we'd use looking back on them. Not because we're dishonest. Because the beginning is always smaller looking than the thing it becomes. The stove said something wooden and settled. She did not look up again, but she was aware of him the way she had grown aware of the house. Not watching for anything in particular, just knowing it was there and that it was hers now to know. In March, the weather broke in a single day, the way it sometimes does in this part of the country. One morning, the cold is absolute, and the next, the light is different, and you can stand outside without the cold having opinions. The snow went heavy and started to go at the edges, and the road turned to the particular mud that resists all argument. Quentin could not get through for a week. The world narrowed to the claim and the barn and the woodpile and the task in front of you. She found that she did not mind it. He was doing something with the fence sections he'd pulled in before the worst of the winter, sorting them in the yard on a day when the sun had real warmth in it for the first time. She brought water out at mid-morning and stood at the edge of the yard with the cup, and he came to her and took it and drank and handed it back and stood looking at the fence sections. He said, "I'll need to replace most of the west run." She said, "How long?" He said, "A week if the ground softens. I'll need to restring the whole thing." He paused. "I could use a hand on the stretching if you're willing." It was plain. It was offered level. It gave her room to say no. She said, "Show me what it needs." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not surprise and not its opposite. Something more like recognition. Then he turned back toward the fence sections, and she came to stand beside him, and he began explaining the work. The week passed in the way weeks pass, when you're doing something with your hands from daybreak to near dark. She learned to read fence wire the way he read it. The places where it had been under tension too long and would go at the first hard pull, the places where it would hold. She learned to work the post pounder without hitting her hands. She learned the proper tension on the line, and the first time she got it right, she felt it in her arms before she could see it in the wire. He said nothing. He ran his hand along the line once, testing it. He moved to the next section. That evening she sat at the table, and her arms were tired in the good way that is different from all other kinds of tired. He sat across from her with his coffee. He said, "You've done this before." She said, "I've done enough things before." He looked at his cup. "I didn't ask." She said, "No." The silence after that was the comfortable kind. There was still a stretch of hard weather in April, which she had been warned about and which arrived anyway, because warnings are not refusals. But it was brief. A week of cold, and then the light changed again, fundamentally this time, the way it changes in spring when it means it. She was in the yard when it happened, just standing in the yard with the first real warmth of the year on her face and her eyes closed. She heard the back door, and then his step on the path, and then he stopped. She did not open her eyes immediately. When she did, he was a few feet away, watching, not with anything she would have named. He was simply looking at her the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, with patience and no hurry. She said, "It's warm." He said, "It is." She said, "First time." He said, "Yes." She looked at the sky. It was blue in a way that had been impossible to imagine through the gray of February and March. Straight above her, no cloud. The poplar stand to the north had started to bud, small and faint. She said, "What's the summer like?" He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things. He said, "Short." She nodded. "But it's there?" He said, "It's there." She looked at him then. He was still watching her. Neither of them looked away. She said, "I wrote my sister," he said. "What did you tell her?" she said. "I told her I was staying." The quiet that came after that had weight and warmth to it. He looked out at the yard. The roan was visible at the fence line, nosing at the post. A crow went over without stopping. The light fell across the new mud of the yard, and it was the color of something beginning. He said, "I'll start the kitchen garden next week. East side of the house, if you want to put in what you like." She said, "I'll think about what I like." He said, "You've got time." She said, "I know." She turned back toward the house. She said, without turning around, "I'll put the coffee on." He said, "All right." She went inside. She filled the pot. She could hear him still in the yard, the slow movement of him. Nothing, hurried the way he always was. She stood at the stove and waited for the water to heat. And outside, the new light came through the kitchen window in a long, pale bar and rested on the floor like something that intended to stay. The mud road through Dunmore ran north until it didn't. She had come to the end of it and found it was not the end of anything at all.